Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to another MOA Live Talk. Today we're going to be talking about archaeology and animal domestication, and to that end, I have a co-host with me who I hope will show his manners and behave. This is my dog, Hades. He's a quarantine dog. I got him, I think, just at the end of March, and he is now 9 months old, and he is giant. But I thought he would make a good prop for today. So we'll see whether or not he can behave himself, keeping in mind that he is still just a baby, just a tiny little baby. Oh, yeah, stay here, baby. All right. So we're going to be talking about animal domestication, and this is something that archaeology in general has really helped us to understand. But there's a lot of questions that we still have about how exactly it happened, because there's a lot of just different stories to tell. All right. So I'm sure that people have an idea in your minds about what a domesticated animal is. Things like dogs, of course, farm animals, sheep and cows, chickens, pigs, work animals, also like horses, camels, and like llamas and alpacas, and basically any other animals that humans take care of and use for other purposes. But really, what is domestication? So generally speaking, a domesticated animal is one that not just relies on, but it's kind of got a mutual dependency with humans. So like with anything, there's kind of a range in that relationship that humans can have with animals. So it's not necessarily always the same. Oh, I know, baby. People are leaving the house. It's very, very, it's disturbing for him. All right. And it's the development of that relationship between humans and animals towards that dependency that we call the process of domestication. And it is important to note that it is a process, so it's not something that happens all at once. He's just trying to lick my mouse hand. He's a very helpful co-host. So we'll put him on screen a little bit more. There he is. Good boy. All right. So what does domestication look like? And Charles Darwin, oh, there he goes, was actually really the first person that we know of, at least, who really started thinking about what that process of how wild animals changed or evolved to be the animals that we are familiar with today. So he recognized that they have a lot of common physical traits that he discussed this as being a kind of phenotypical convergence. So phenotype is basically how you look. So people can have very similar genetic makeup. So if you think about siblings from the same parents, for example, they can look very different. So for example, I have dark brown hair and my sister is very blonde. And they can have different eye colors, skin colors, all sorts of different variations in phenotype, and so how that's expressed. But when it comes to animals, genes also can play a large role in behavior. And with domesticated animals, there tends to be sort of like a package of things that we see with them. So the traits of domestication that were recognized by Darwin include variations in coat color and texture, general docility, shifts in reproductive timing, and then alterations in the skull shape and in the tooth. Oh, yeah, there we go. He had something to say. And then we also get things like dwarf and giant varieties of different animals. And also another one that Hades does not demonstrate very well is floppy ears. So there's a pretty famous experiment that was done in the 50s in Russia to try and domesticate silver foxes by selecting just selecting for tameness. So although that was the only qualification that they were selecting for, they started to see other kinds of these traits show up. So even though all they were really looking for was, is this fox gonna bite me? No, okay, maybe we'll keep it and we'll breed it with other more docile foxes. They started to see some of these same traits. So the changes to the skull, the changes to the teeth, and changes to coat color and texture, and of course the floppy ears. So these things are not necessarily something that people were trying to get to in domestication, but they sort of came with it. And I'll talk a little bit about how and why we think some of that happened. So some of these elements, especially the changes to the skull structure, are directly identifiable in the archaeological record. So we can see them, we can recognize the difference between maybe a domesticated versus a wild animal. And this can get complicated. So as anybody who's been following along this live talk series knows, it's not always that simple. So we can see those changes, but there's still debate about where in that process of domestication these changes start to happen. So like even with the silver foxes, you start to see these different traits appear, but not necessarily at the point where we have what we would really consider domesticated tame silver fox. So they kind of come in with that process, but they don't necessarily reflect an end product of a domesticated animal. So while they're really useful, they're not the only thing that we can or really should look at to try and understand domestication, or to sort of draw that line between wild and domesticated. And again, it isn't a line, it's a process. So fortunately, archaeology is good for understanding past behaviors, and we can use changes in both human and animal behavior to help us understand how domestication occurred. So then, how did it happen? It's generally understood to have happened along basically 3 different pathways. So there's the commensal pathway, the prey pathway, and then the directed pathway. So those are sort of the 3 ways. And these all depend on basically different relationships that humans had between the animals that intensified in different ways based on different kinds of contact along a continuum, starting with like anthrophilia, so basically being able to tolerate human presence that not all animals can do, to commensalism, which is kind of a relationship that's beneficial to at least one group, and then the other is at least neutral. So they're like, okay, fine, that's okay, and the other one is, you know, actually benefiting in some way from that relationship. And then you start to see control in the wild, to control of captive animals, and then you get into sort of more like extensive and intensive breeding, and then finally to sort of like what we would really call domesticated animal, or even to like the pet level. So in the first 2 pathways, though, domestication was not really the explicit goal, or at least not at the start. So people weren't setting out to be like, okay, I'm going to tame this animal and make use of it in a way that's beneficial to me and my village or community or whatever. So when we're talking about the commensal pathway, as I said, like commensal means, you know, it's beneficial to one and sort of neutral to another. And so it's just that ability to tolerate them. And usually it's what it is beneficial to the animals and then tolerable to humans. Like there's a behavior there that starts off that way. And then that relationship is increased as the benefits to humans, and we start to see a more mutually beneficial relationship as well. So usually what happens is they see like a human adaptation to the environment attracts animals, and that environment exerts new pressures on the animals that results in the natural selection for particular survival traits, including an increased ability to tolerate human presence and human behaviors. Humans also over time get habituated to that presence, and they form a kind of reciprocal relationship, leading to more direct controlled breeding and other kinds of interaction with humans. So human-related habitat specialization can lead to other changes, including breeding habits. So if you're changing the landscape in which animals are existing, then that can have an impact on their behavior. It can bring them into more close contact with humans, for example, if there's providing new different food sources that animals are taking advantage of, and that can lead to sort of that habituation. And then once humans start to see a benefit to themselves of the presence of these animals and ways that they can exploit them, then that can continue on further down that path towards domestication. So it isn't even necessarily at the start that humans are directly controlling animals. It's just they're creating an environment in which these things can start to happen. And the important thing here is what you start to see is less gene flow between these groups that have become habituated to humans and external groups. So they're starting to like have self-select for populations that are more accustomed to humans and have these other kinds of relationships with them. So these beneficial traits towards domestication start to reinforce each other. So again, it doesn't really necessarily require direct human intervention to start along this pathway at the early stages, although it can happen that way. So this is the pathway that people generally think that cats and dogs followed, but there's lots of other animals that did too. The favorite one that I came across that surprised me the most when I was doing this research was actually guinea pigs in South America. So they appear to have followed this pathway by becoming habituated to humans by scavenging for basically kitchen scraps. And so once they came around more and humans were like, wow, these animals are small and easy to catch, and we'll just keep them. That makes them easier to catch and makes them more accessible as a food source, essentially. In Asia, we have chickens, ducks, geese, and actually carp as well. We maybe don't think about fish as being domesticated, but they actually have been in some contexts, and they all follow this pathway as well. There's some debate about pigs, about whether or not they might have, but there is some evidence to suggest that at least pig domestication started along this pathway. Unlike other kinds of prey animals, pigs are omnivores as well, so they could be attracted to human settlements in that same way. And then also pigeons on an early domesticate out of Egypt, actually, seem to have followed this pathway as well. Come here, Hades. Oh, can you come up on this side? Come on. Come here. Come on. Come here. Let everybody see your big, not so floppy ears. So, the commensal pathway is generally thought to be the first pathway that was followed towards domestication. And again, it's very unintentional, especially at the early stages. Dogs, we generally agree, or archaeologists agree, were the first domesticated animal, following this pathway more or less, sometime in the past 50,000 years. So 50, in the upper Paleolithic period, essentially. They're really interesting because most of the other early domesticates were food animals. And while people did and do use dogs as food animals, that's not really reflective of the relationship between humans and wolves, right? So if somebody's being eaten in that context, is probably not the wolf, generally speaking. They're not typically associated with being a prey animal. So there's a couple of different narratives and sort of theories that people have come up with in terms of how dogs were domesticated. And one of those is the idea of wolves following human hunter-gatherers and sort of coming along the remains of kill sites and sort of getting habituated to scavenging in those contexts. And then slowly sort of becoming more reliant in the way that I talked about, like having more self-selection for animals who are capable of getting along with humans, maybe not attacking them. But there's pushback to this idea also. So generally speaking, we know ethnographically, that's not really reflective of most people's relationship with wolves. So generally speaking, humans try to discourage predators from following along their camps because humans can also be a prey animal. So when I talk about commensal, again, I said it has to be beneficial to one and at least neutral to the other, and that's not necessarily a neutral relationship. So the other possibility, the other theory that's been presented is that humans were actually bringing wolf puppies into their encampments on purpose and raising them, like picking them up young enough that they would imprint on humans as being caretakers, and because wolves are such social animals that they would be able to be socialized to react to humans in that way. A very social animal. And then raising them not necessarily for pets, but for other purposes, like, for example, keeping them around so that you could wait until they were a little older and then use them for their fur, for example, for winter clothing in colder climates, using them for other kinds of tools, so using the teeth, using the long bones in other particular ways, using them for their meat, but also using them in ritual contexts as well, where people have like symbolic relationships with wolves and they might want to have them accessible for particular rites and rituals, but not have to go and find an adult like feral wolf that you would then have to capture or whatnot. It's much easier to deal with younger ones that you can sort of groom and prepare like for whatever purpose they're going to be serving eventually. And then over time, this kind of relationship, the theory here goes, is that they would keep the tamer ones. Oh, Hades. So they would keep the tamer ones around, maybe allow them to breed, and then just eventually over time develop sort of a more docile population that eventually became dogs. So the arguments for this particular line of domestication for wolves comes from, again, these ethnographic descriptions about relationships with wolves. Oh, he's trying to eat my hand. It's not very helpful. Lost my train of thought. Okay, enough, baby. And so they're comparing sort of these relationships and uses of wolves in contemporary cultures, and comparing them to patterns that we see in the archaeological record. So for example, if we find wolf carcasses, or they do find wolf carcasses with signs that they have been or had their pelts removed, so they're sort of using that ethnographic example to say, well, maybe that's what was going on here. They had these young puppies, they waited until they were old enough to provide a pelt that was useful, and then they butchered them for that particular purpose. So it's interesting, and again, for something that we're so interested in, and for this relationship that we've had for such a long time with dogs in particular, there's still so many questions about how exactly it happened. So one of the other pathways is the prey pathway. And so this, again, like I was saying with the commensal pathway, is not so much about people going to be like, I'm going to tame these animals and I'm going to keep them and it's going to make my life easier. It's the small changes along their way about trying to make food sources more reliable that eventually led to domestication. So prey animals wouldn't have been attracted to human settlements in the same kind of way as wolves, and they're not necessarily sociable in the same way as dogs are, where you couldn't necessarily just take the babies and raise them and expect them to be able to provide what you need from them. All right? So that kind of like, oh honey, I know you don't like being on camera. Are you camera shy? Are you camera shy? Are you? Yeah, you just see the nose. Big nose. There he is. Big nose. Maybe we'll put him there so he can be more in frame. All right, you can see him eat my hands. So in this case, it was really more about intentional human resource management by settled humans for the most part, so people who are already living in settled communities with a range of different subsistence strategies. So they're not following their resources anymore, so they need to make sure that they still have access to this kind of like prey, to this food source. And they, of course, they're also changing, again, they're changing that environment by introducing these agricultural fields. So they're changing the habitats that are available around them to these animals. So again, this sort of starts with like game management. So making sure you're not hunting everything out, making sure that they do have the habitats that they need, for example, and then more specifically into herd management. So making sure that the demographics are favorable for the continuation of the species and the population in the local area. And then herd management. So again, it's about making sure that you're only, for example, maybe only hunting the young males. So you're leaving the older ones that are more genetically viable, and you're leaving the breeding females as well. And then selective breeding eventually for specific traits like size, quality, temperament, and so on and so forth. So again, it's this like long process over time that leads us from a wild animal towards a tame one. So classic examples, again, of the prey pathway include most of the kinds of farm animals that we think about, like goats and sheep and cows. We can see this archaeologically as well. So by around 10,000 years ago, people were already practicing this kind of game and herd management. So archaeologists at a site in Israel examined the remains from both wild pigs and cows. And what they saw was evidence that the population was being significantly overhunted, suggesting that the population management that followed this period was actually like a deliberate response to making sure that these populations remained viable and as a food source, right? So again, it's not intentional domestication, it's a result of other deliberate strategies that humans are following that influence the relationship between humans and animals. So the increased human interaction forces selection of traits that become sort of bundled with this less aversion to animals. So in the Americas, we have llamas, alpacas, turkeys also, and Muscovy ducks, which is the one that surprised me, all follow the sort of prey pathway to domestication. And then reindeer are actually probably the most recent domesticate to follow this pathway. And they're interesting on a couple of different levels. First of all, the people who were domesticated them were not a settled population. They were nomadic. And also they're actually the only cervid, the only like deer that's ever been successfully domesticated. So the other thing that's relevant here is that in most cases, these animals were domesticated for their meat, mostly. Reindeer, again, an exception to that. And afterwards comes what we call the secondary product revolution. And that's where humans started using them for other products, like dairy, for example, and also fiber for textiles. And eventually, this is Hades knocking around my table. And then things like their labor as well, so like hauling and pulling things and like horse wheels and that sort of stuff. So the last pathway to talk about is actually the directed pathway. And this is the only pathway that begins with human intention to domesticate an animal because it presents some value to them. And this is this is done by people who have already domesticated other animals, or who already have other domesticated animals and know that this can be done, that this process is possible. So they have an idea of how it works, and so on. So this is usually used more for animals that people can use as an energy source, rather than and for other purposes, rather than just like the domesticating them for meat or for other purposes. So, for example, horses are on we believe horses to have followed the direct pathway towards domestication. So people they saw them as being valuable, not necessarily for their meat, but for their ability to be ridden and to pull things. Also, donkeys and camels also follow this line of domestication. This also covers a lot of animals that were bred to be companion animals or pets, like gerbils and chinchillas, for example. Ferrets also. So these are, like I said, they're the three, there are generally thought to be sort of three major centers of domestication, though it did happen in other places as well. And these are really kind of related to the places where humans started to have like independent permanent settlement. So we're looking at the Near East, so like Turkey, the upper regions of the Middle East and over onto Egypt, central China as well, and then the Andes areas. And I should also note that not all animals can be domesticated. So they need to at least be able to meet certain criteria, including the ability to get to a point where they can tolerate human presence. And some of them really just have too strong instincts for that. They have the wrong kind of family structure to allow humans to be able to influence their breeding. There's a lot of other things that come into that question about whether or not an animal can be domesticated. So we have evidence, for example, that there was an early game management of gazelles in Africa, but they just weren't able to become domesticated because they weren't able to meet some of these criteria about, especially being able to become accustomed to humans. Now, it's also generally thought that commensal domestication was the first pathway that was followed. As I said, dogs were the first domesticated well before any other animals. And in most cases, we think most animals were only ever domesticated once and then they spread. So there are some exceptions to that, and there's some debates about particular animals. Pigs, again, there's some question about how exactly that happened, whether it happened more than once and where, whether it always even followed the same pathway. They're kind of an interesting animal in that regard. But for example, there's some early Chinese commensal domesticates, like I was saying, like ducks and ducks especially, and geese, that we think might have been domesticated directly in other parts of Europe much later. But I've seen that the suggestion there, but I didn't have a chance to really get into the research on that. But there's some questions about where and when different animals have been domesticated, whether it happened more than once. But generally speaking, we tend to think that it was only ever done once. It can be difficult to tell, though, because what happens is that domesticated animals will breed with local wild animals, and so they'll bring those local genes into their own gene pool, which can make it muddied about whether or not the relationships between the wild populations and the initial domesticates or not. So it can just be a little bit complicated to sort of tease out that question if you're only looking at the DNA. So I do want to talk about a little bit more about some of the ways that we can identify domestication, and how we can examine it through the archaeological record. So I talked a little bit about some of the morphological traits that Darwin identified, but I want to get into that a little bit more. So a lot of the traits that we associate with domesticated animals are what we call pedomorphic traits. So they're basically traits that retain aspects of like being juvenile and not being fully mature in some ways. So, whenever you're calling your dog or your cat a big baby, which I do all the time, you're not really wrong. They kind of are in some ways. I mentioned some of these before, but in particular, the pedomorphic traits include like an earlier sexual maturity, more frequent sexual receptivity. There we go. So they're more receptive, more frequently receptive to sexual activity. They have smaller brain sizes, and then there's also changes along with that in sort of the neurological organization inside the brain as well, because they're not relying on the same kinds of instincts. They're not in the same kinds of environments where they have to always watch out for themselves. There's sort of a lot of human management of that for the animal, so they lose their ability to do that for themselves. Most again, Hades has wandered off, but I was going to say one of the classic examples is him having a shorter snout. He doesn't really show that. And a smaller and fewer teeth also. So a lot of those changes are seen in the jaw. There's less sexual dimorphism, so there's not as much of a visual difference between males and females in domesticated species as in wild ones. And they're just overall smaller as well on the whole. I mean, again, like, once an animal has been domesticated, humans will do all kinds of things with them. So we go from something that looks like maybe more like a husky to something that looks like a German Shepherd or like a tiny little Chihuahua. There's a lot of variation within the domesticated animals. But in dogs, for instance, we see those domestication markers really in the face. So they have a shorter face, so their snout is shorter overall. They tend to have a steeper forehead, so wolves have more of a profile, like here's their snout and then it goes low, and then dogs tend to go up more and have more of a sloped, more steep forehead. They have, again, shorter jaws, so their teeth are more crowded, and their teeth tend to get smaller as well. So again, these are things that tend to be related to having that earlier sexual maturity. So they're not taking as long to get into adulthood, and so those complete adulthood traits aren't always there in the same way that we see in the wild ones. So if you think back to what I was saying about people keeping and breeding puppies, especially like young wolf puppies, and not necessarily letting them get to an older aggressive phase, so that might be the sort of thing that you would expect to see in these cases. So in prey pathway animals, a lot of the times it's the opposite kind of context, where you have the younger males that are being culled, and it's the older males that are kept alive, and of course all of the breeding females. So we don't necessarily see the same kinds of cranial transformations in the prey pathway that we do in the commensal pathway. And it's just, again, because the relationships between humans and the animals were different, and so the traits that were being selected for either among the animal populations themselves or by the humans that are breeding them are different. So when humans start breeding animals, we're selecting their mates. So animals aren't making those choices. They're not following those instincts really in the same way to look for the same kinds of things. So humans aren't necessarily breeding animals for the same reasons that animals think they should breed themselves for. So horns are an interesting example. So under human management, they're not necessarily the same. So same for cats. Cats are kind of weird, but like, again, the reasons that they're domesticated sort of influence how those traits impact them. So cats, for example, don't show that floppy ear-ness that we get. So we don't, there's a lot of questions about how and when and where cat domestication happened. I did read some articles on it, but I was trying to find something that was talking about some of these morphological traits in cats, and I didn't find anything specific. I do think we see some of that, we see the decreased cranial capacity, we see the more steeper forehead. I do think we see, for example, the changes in the teeth to some extent, but it's not all the same because we kept cats as a carnivore as a benefit to us, right? So part of the things that cats offer humans is their ability to catch pests, and so it's not necessarily something we were trying to breed out even as we domesticated them. So those remained favorable characteristics for cats to have even under human control. So I think that's part of the reason that they're a little bit different. We didn't necessarily breed out those traits, and we weren't interested in cats losing those traits, so we didn't force them to self-select to lose them either in quite the same way. So I think that's how it goes with cats. They are interesting and a little bit different than some of the other ones. So they're one of the other carnivores that we have had a long time domesticated relationship with. But again, they're neat. I really got carried away in the research for this talk. There's just so many fascinating things to read about this. So unfortunately I wasn't able to get everything into the actual talk, but I hope there's some stuff of interest. I can tell I'm already gonna go, I think, longer than I had intended to, but we'll power through. So I was saying, yeah, so there's this human control. When humans are operating the breeding and selecting mates for animals, we start to see different traits being selected for, essentially. So I'm going to skip some of the stuff I had prepared, just again, because I am running a little bit longer. But I did want to talk about this sort of loss of brain size. And that, again, it's partly because humans are regulating the environment for animals. They're not, their brains aren't being constructed in the same way in response to the same kind of stimuli as wild animals. Is there an animal today that they're working on domesticating? Kind of. One of the articles that I read was actually about human relationships with white-tailed deer and how sort of like the trophy hunting industry and the idea of like creating desirable game animals and putting them into an environment where people can find them like reliably is having this same kind of influence on white-tailed deer. I don't know, like again, so far reindeer are the only successfully domesticated cervids. I think there have been other experiments with trying to domesticate cervids that haven't worked. So other deer, I think like red deer, people have tried to domesticate before. But they're still having an impact that sort of shows a change in that relationship in a way. So there probably are other things, like if you think about the exotic pet trade, for example, you could look at that as being steps along the the directed pathway that people are starting to take. And these are processes that can take like a very long time, like generations and generations, thousands of years to complete these processes. So arguably, yes. I don't know of any today that, like, I don't know of any particular, like, specialized, like, projects that people are going on, but I do think that there are animals that are undergoing some of these changes in relationships that are moving towards domestication, either intentionally or unintentionally. So, yes, kind of. Hope that was a useful answer. Anyway. So I was talking about brain size reduction. And one of the reasons I wanted to talk about that was because there's been some interesting studies looking at animals that were domesticated and have sort of turned feral again. So populations that were abandoned or that escaped. So feral pigs is one I was sort of went into this talk sort of wondering about that. We hear a lot about them being a problem, especially in the States, and now moving into Canada. But I know that there are populations of feral pigs elsewhere where people have brought domesticated pigs into an area and either like left them there as sort of game caching for future trips through the area, or if they're just settlements that have been abandoned or they've escaped. So there's this kind of a problem all over the world. I'm like, well, what happens to them? Because we take domesticated pigs and we do see them sort of revert in some ways to a more wild animal. But they do retain, apparently, some of these domesticated traits. So we do see, and pigs actually, I don't remember the percentages and I didn't write it down, but they are actually the animal where we see the most reduction in brain size from the original wild animal to the domesticated species. And they regain some of that when they turn feral, when they're released into a wild population. And they regain other traits, so their snout gets longer again, and sort of they get overall larger. They have their forelimb sizes and their limb sizes get longer again as well. So they revert some of these physical traits, but they don't gain it all back. And brain size is one where they definitely retain on the whole like better than your average domesticated pig, but definitely less than your original wild pig progenitor for this species. So they don't really get that back. And I think it's important to acknowledge that domestication does have permanent effects on animal species, whether or not they're released again into the wild. And that this impacts their ability to survive in particular environments and how they engage in those environments without that human interaction. I also wanted to talk I'll try and get through this last bit relatively quickly, but I wanted to talk about some of the other ways that we do see domestication in the archaeological record, because again, some of these morphological traits, there's questions about when exactly they came in. So we can look at... Sorry about that. Come here, baby. Come here. I know. I think people have just come home from being outside, and so that's why Hades is playing his guard role. Hey, come here. Come here. Come here. Come here. Yeah, okay. So we can look at some things like changes to habitats and the impact that that has on animals. We can look at isotopic data to see what both humans and animals are eating. And the diet can tell us those mutual relationships. So talking about cats again, one of the articles, just 1 second, I'm just gonna let him out of the room so that hopefully he'll stop barking. I'll be right back. Oh, come on, sir. Or at least if he's barking, he's not barking on camera. So yes, looking at isotopic data, we can see that in cats. Actually, there's one population of archaeological cats that they found, and they did do isotopic analysis of them to see what they were eating, and they found at least one of the specimens was eating a lot of grain. So it wasn't actually relying on like caught prey. It seems much more likely that it was being fed, and we found it in a context where it was actually buried with people also. So again, it's reinforcing that idea that it had a relationship with humans. That it wasn't, that it had been at least somewhat domesticated. So we can look at other kinds of data as well. So we can look at things like how humans are like taking their prey, like I said in that one study where they were looking at evidence to see whether or not animals were being overhunted. We can also see like, are they taking, like, are they exhibiting game selection in the animals that they are hunting that indicate some kind of game or herd management towards that, like, move us along this pathway towards domestication. We can also look at zoographic data, so looking at animals that are occurring outside of their natural range. So like if you're looking at cats again, appearing in an area where we don't have a wild cat population. So we have some of the earliest evidence of cat domestication we have comes from Cyprus for that very reason. Like there are no native wild cats on Cyprus, and yet we do find cat remains in archaeological contexts, and so we know that the people had to have brought them into that space. So we can sort of use that. Though we do have to make, like in any of these things, you have to account for other factors that might be influencing the presence or the whatever you're looking at. You always have to look for other answers also. You can't always just go for the one that you want to believe. So same as ever. You can also see like direct evidence, for example, of population control in structures that are associated with keeping animals. So you can look at, say, do they have a corral or a pen established to care for these animals? You can look at an increase in use of animal products as well. So are they using more domesticated animal materials in construction of clothing or other kinds of tool use as well? So you can see it there. And then one of the other ones I thought was interesting was there was an example where there was a lot of botanical remains of particular grasses that was associated as a food source of a domesticated animal. I think it was a goat, and they were arguing that this was increased in the archaeological record because people were using the dung as fuel, and so the seeds in the grass remains were getting better preserved because they were more introduced more into that human environment through that domestication process. So there's just lots of other ways that we could sort of get at these different relationships between humans and animals. But again, this has already gone on quite long. And again, it was just a really fun, interesting topic for me to look at. I really learned a lot looking at it. I hope this has been interesting for people who have been listening. Again, if you do have any other questions, I'd be happy to answer them if I can, or look up the answers for you if I'm not sure off the top of my head. But thank you for joining us. I will say next Tuesday, we're actually going to be having a new presenter for our MOA, for sadly some of our MOA live talks, and her name is Lauren. So she is going to be talking about like contagious disease spread in archaeology and how we can look at some past examples of that. So thank you all very much, and I hope to see you join us again on Tuesday. Have a great weekend.